Norwegian researchers have for the first time captured footage of a 30-year-old shipwreck. Researchers from Norway and Russia have discovered radioactive leakage from a Soviet-era submarine wreck in the Norwegian Sea.
Along the quiet coastline near Vladivostok, the sea looks ordinary, calm, almost peaceful. But just beneath the surface lies a story that has been hidden for decades. Locals speak in hushed tones about the so-called submarine graveyard, where remnants of an era long past now sit abandoned, corroding in silence. These aren't just old vessels forgotten by time. They're part of a much larger and more complex legacy, one that experts have only recently begun to uncover in full. And what they've found beneath those waters is far more troubling than anyone ever imagined. Back during the height of the Cold War, the Soviet Union built a massive fleet of nuclear submarines. These powerful machines were designed not only to patrol vast oceans, but to serve as a visible display of strength. Dozens were launched every year, and many constructed at shipyards in places like the Kola Peninsula and far eastern ports including Vladivostok and Petropavlovsk. Some of them were massive. The Typhoon-class submarines, for example, stretched over 170 meters long and could carry enough firepower to change the course of history. But all of that power came with a hidden cost. As time passed and these submarines aged, the question emerged: what happens when a vessel designed to carry nuclear fuel is no longer needed? The Soviet strategy was simple: tie them up, set them aside, and deal with it later. And in Vladivostok, that later never really came. Submarines were moored near shore, stripped of parts, and left to rust in shallow waters. Locals began calling it the Submarine Cemetery, a nickname that hints at the eerie sight of conning towers poking above the waves, surrounded by salt water and silence. Many of these submarines still contained their nuclear reactor compartments. Some still held spent fuel. And over time, with exposure to the elements and little oversight, these steel giants began to break down. Dealing with even one nuclear submarine is a logistical challenge. It requires removing the fuel, safely handling radioactive components, and cutting apart the vessel with equipment most shipyards didn't have. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, Russia inherited not only the fleet, but the full burden of this unfinished task. And the funding to deal with it just wasn't there. By the early 1990s, experts estimated that more than 180 nuclear submarines needed to be dismantled. But with limited resources, many were left tied up at docks or anchored in remote bays, still holding their reactor systems. In Vladivostok, this reality was impossible to miss. A growing collection of submarine hulls lined the coast, some floating, others partially submerged. Engineers and former naval officers say many of these submarines were never meant to sit for this long, and the longer they did, the greater the risk became. One particularly tragic event revealed just how dangerous things could get. In August of 1985, during what was supposed to be a routine operation in Chazma Bay, something went catastrophically wrong. Technicians were refueling a nuclear submarine when a chain reaction inside the reactor triggered a violent explosion. The blast sent a plume of radioactive material into the air and left a trail of destruction in its wake. Fires burned for hours. Nearby workers were caught in the chaos. The aftermath was kept secret for years, but after the fall of the Soviet Union, reports began to surface. Soil and water samples showed elevated radiation levels, equipment was contaminated, and long after the smoke cleared, the effects remained. The explosion became a warning, one that experts would reference again and again as they studied the decommissioned submarines near Vladivostok. The lesson was clear: these vessels weren't just historical artifacts, they were active environmental threats. Rusting hulls, leaking materials, and incomplete dismantling added up to a risk that grew with every year of delay. Following the collapse of the Soviet Union, Russia faced the full weight of the decommissioning challenge. Submarines with dangerous materials still inside were scattered across northern and eastern coasts. Some had been partially dismantled, others not touched at all. Funding was inconsistent. Specialized facilities were limited, and records weren't always reliable. In some cases, it wasn't even clear which submarines had been defueled and which had not. That gap in knowledge alarmed observers and made coordinated cleanup even harder. Eventually, international help stepped in. Programs were launched with assistance from the United States, Japan, Norway, and other countries. They provided funding and technical support, allowing Russia to safely defuel dozens of submarines and dismantle others. But progress was slow. Cutting apart a single vessel could take over a year. And while some submarines were successfully processed, many more remained in line, waiting for their turn. Storage became another challenge. Once reactor compartments were removed, they had to be stored somewhere safe for decades. Russia created open-air storage sites where massive steel sections were placed side by side. But even defueled reactors contain residual radioactivity. They require constant monitoring, and in some cases, especially in the Far East, distance from major infrastructure made even transporting the components difficult. Local communities started asking questions. Independent groups conducted surveys. The results confirmed what many had feared. Radioactive material was present not just in the submarines, but in the surrounding environment. And the risks weren't just environmental, they were economic too. Fishing is a vital industry in the region. If marine life is exposed to contaminants, export markets suffer, and livelihoods are threatened. International concern grew. Monitoring teams took readings. They found elevated levels of certain isotopes in sediment and water samples, and still, many submarine compartments remained untouched. In Vladivostok, surveys revealed that reactor assemblies still sat inside several vessels. Some were not even logged in official records. The discrepancy raised new concerns. If reactors were overlooked or unaccounted for, what else might have been missed? Experts warned that without a clear timeline and full transparency, risks would continue to grow, especially as steel deteriorates and compartments break down. And then came the political questions. Some officials downplayed the situation, suggesting it was under control. Others admitted that more action was needed. Local leaders called for federal support, pointing to health and environmental concerns. Meanwhile, independent researchers pushed for open access to radiation data and full public disclosure of all monitoring results. The situation in Vladivostok is now seen as part of a much larger issue. Similar sites exist elsewhere in Russia, some in the Arctic, others along remote coastlines. The danger is cumulative. Radioactive elements don't disappear. They settle in sediment, move through currents, and can impact marine life for generations. Experts are clear about the path forward. First, any remaining submarines or reactor compartments that still contain fuel need to be defueled safely. Second, secure long-term storage must replace temporary solutions. Third, transparent monitoring must continue, with data made publicly available. And finally, renewed international cooperation is needed to provide both funding and technical expertise. Currents don't stop at borders. This isn't just a Russian problem. It's a regional one, and eventually a global one. The lesson is simple. Letting a nuclear fleet decay in shallow water is not just poor planning. It's a long-term hazard with real-world consequences. Each year that passes without action increases the cost, complexity, and danger of cleanup. The submarine graveyard near Vladivostok is more than a relic of history. It's an urgent reminder of the responsibilities that come with nuclear power, and the risks we all share when those responsibilities are ignored. And yet for years, the issue remained in the shadows. It's easy to understand why. Rusting steel, partially submerged vessels, and forgotten compartments don't exactly command headlines unless a crisis erupts. But what if the crisis is already happening? Not in a single explosion or dramatic leak, but in the quiet, continuous seep of radioactive material into the sea, into the food chain, and eventually into us. The risk isn't just theoretical. Radiation doesn't need to be seen to be dangerous. It doesn't warn you with sound or smell. It builds over time, accumulating in sediment, in fish, in the bodies of people who live nearby. That's what makes the Vladivostok site so concerning. It's not just about the Cold War relics, it's about the invisible threat they still carry. And it's about how that threat grows stronger with every year of inaction. Scientists who've studied the site say the reactors still housed inside some of the submarines could pose a serious hazard if left unmonitored. Saltwater is unforgiving. Steel doesn't just rust, it weakens, it cracks, and eventually it fails. When that happens in a sealed reactor compartment, the consequences can escalate quickly. Materials once contained become part of the surrounding environment. Traces begin to appear in seafood, soil, water, and eventually human bodies. That's the chilling reality behind the calm surface of the bay. The Cold War ended decades ago, but the leftovers remain. Hulks of power, stripped of their usefulness but still packed with danger. And that danger isn't limited to Russia. Ocean currents don't respect national borders. What leaks in one country's harbor can end up in another country's waters. That's why this issue matters to everyone. Some experts argue that the situation is manageable, that the reactors are stable, the fuel is shielded, and the risk is minimal. But that confidence has been shaken before. Chernobyl, Fukushima. Each began with assurances that things were under control until they weren't. What's happening in Vladivostok might not be an active crisis yet, but it's a sleeping one. And history shows that sleeping crises don't stay asleep forever. The real tragedy here isn't just the presence of these submarines, it's that we've known about them for years. Mapping surveys, satellite images, even on-the-ground inspections have confirmed their condition. And still, the response has been slow, fragmented, and often underfunded. International help has made a difference. Programs between countries have led to real progress, but they haven't been enough to finish the job. Because dismantling a nuclear fleet isn't quick, it isn't cheap, and it isn't something you can push off indefinitely. Each decommissioned submarine is a massive, complex machine. Removing the reactor compartments alone requires specialized equipment, trained crews, secure transport, and long-term storage solutions. Cutting corners is not an option. Every shortcut adds risk. Every delay increases the chance of a structural failure. Every lost year pushes us closer to the point where cleanup becomes a matter of emergency response instead of careful planning. So why does it keep getting pushed down the list? Because it's hidden. Because the threat isn't loud. Because political capital is often spent elsewhere. And because cleaning up old military hardware doesn't win elections or boost approval ratings. But none of that changes the reality. This is a problem that will not go away on its own. Ask anyone living near Vladivostok. Fishermen whose families have worked the same waters for generations. Parents raising children within a few kilometers of the coast. People who have started to ask questions about the fish they eat, the water they drink, and the future of their environment. They aren't waiting for another government report. They've already seen the rusting towers, the decaying hulls, the silent legacy of a forgotten fleet. And now they want answers. Environmental organizations are stepping in to do what governments sometimes won't. Independent radiation testing, sediment analysis, satellite monitoring. These are the tools being used to build a clearer picture. And that picture isn't comforting. It suggests that inaction has already allowed dangerous conditions to form. That the line between manageable and unmanageable is getting thinner. That we may already be living with the consequences. So where does this leave us with a choice? We can look away, pretend that these relics don't matter, assume that rust will hold and fuel won't leak. Or we can face the truth. This is a situation that demands urgency. It requires real funding, real cooperation, real transparency. It's not about blame or politics, it's about shared responsibility. Because at the end of the day, this isn't just Russia's problem, this is a global issue. A reminder of what happens when power is pursued without a long-term plan for what comes after. A warning about the price of delay, and a test of our willingness to take action before it's too late. Fixing this won't be easy. It will take years, maybe decades. It will cost money. It will require partnerships across borders and between governments that don't always see eye to eye. But the alternative? The alternative is far worse. Letting these submarines rot in shallow water isn't just neglect. It's gambling with ecosystems, with livelihoods, and with human health. There's no single moment of resolution here. No switch to flip that makes the problem disappear. But there is a path forward, step by step, reactor by reactor, hull by hull. Every vessel removed from the bay, every fuel assembly secured, every leak prevented, that's progress. and it's a kind of progress the world can't afford to delay any longer. So the question isn't whether the problem is real, it's whether the response will come in time, whether we have the political will, the resources, and the international resolve to finish what was started decades ago, and whether we'll learn the lesson before another reminder comes at a much higher cost. What do you think?